Chapter 1. Lost in the Wastelands. Lyra's legs ached with each step, her thin frame swaying in the harsh winds sweeping across the barren wastelands. She was alone, her once bustling world reduced to desolation. She'd watched as her tribe fled in a panic, abandoning her in the chaos of the raid. With a heavy heart, Lyra now wandered through the ruined landscape, hoping against hope for some sign of life, of food, of shelter, of something, anything, to sustain her. The Galactic girl's senses were heightened, a survival instinct deeply rooted in her species' physiology. Her skin, a pale lavender that shimmered under her planet's dim twin suns, was covered in a fine, scaly texture that helped retain moisture. Despite her body's adaptations, she was reaching the limits of her endurance. Her people had always told tales of the wastelands, stories meant to keep the young from wandering too far from their villages. Now, she understood why. There was nothing here but sand, rocky outcroppings, and the distant howls of predators that lurked in the night. Days passed, though they melded into each other in the endless sameness of the landscape. Hunger gnawed at her, and her throat felt raw and parched. Her instincts told her she wouldn't last much longer, and she started to wonder if this wasteland would be her final resting place. As her vision blurred, she felt her knees buckle, and she collapsed onto the hard ground. Just as she was ready to surrender to the darkness, a metallic glint caught her eye. Gathering the last shreds of her strength, she dragged herself forward. It was a wreckage, partially buried in the sands, and it looked alien, unlike anything she'd seen in her own village. A human spacecraft. Her pulse quickened. She had heard of humans, a species from a distant world, rumored to be both dangerous and resilient. Lyra's tribe had always spoken of them with a mixture of fear and awe, warning that humans were to be avoided. But now, all those warnings felt irrelevant. This was her chance. If there was even a fragment of food or water on that ship, she had to try. The ship was small, a single-person craft from what she could tell, with its hull scarred and twisted from a rough landing. As she approached, the faint hum of a distress beacon reached her ears, barely audible over the wind. She climbed over the wreckage, her fingers scraping against the jagged metal, and finally peered inside the cockpit. A human lay there, slumped over the controls. His face was pale, covered in dust and dried blood, and his breathing was shallow. Lyra recoiled slightly, a mix of fear and awe pulsing through her. Here was one of the fabled humans alive, yet barely. But despite her initial hesitation, a deep compassion stirred within her. This human was no threat. He was just as helpless as she was. With trembling hands, she reached out, gently shaking his shoulder. "Human," she whispered in her native tongue, though she doubted he'd understand. The man stirred, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal weary, bloodshot eyes. He looked at her, disoriented, a mixture of confusion and surprise flashing across his face. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither moving. Lyra noted his strength even in this weakened state. His eyes held a fire, a determination, that resonated with her own desire to survive. After a tense silence, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Water, please." His language was foreign, but she understood his meaning. Lyra glanced around the cockpit, hoping to find something, anything, to quench his thirst. She noticed a small compartment and pulled it open, revealing a container filled with a faintly tinted liquid. Human water, she assumed, though its color seemed slightly off. She hesitated before handing it to him, watching as he gulped it down greedily. After a few sips, he leaned back, visibly relieved. "Thank you," he murmured, still eyeing her with a mixture of gratitude and caution. Lyra's own throat burned, her parched lips aching for relief, but she pushed her needs aside. The human was injured, possibly on the brink of death. She could survive a bit longer. She had to. But as she looked around the cockpit, she realized there was no food, no supplies, no sustenance that could sustain them for long. Just broken machinery and a few remnants of human technology. The man, Captain Ethan Gray, as she would later learn, tried to sit up, wincing in pain as he clutched his side. Lyra noticed a deep wound stretching along his ribcage, the edges crusted with dried blood. It looked infected, the skin around it swollen and angry. Ethan's gaze softened as he met her eyes, and he attempted a faint smile. "Guess we're both in a rough spot, huh?" Lyra tilted her head, catching the faint humor in his tone despite the language barrier. She could feel his vulnerability, his struggle to maintain a semblance of strength. She offered a reassuring nod, mimicking his gesture in an attempt to communicate solidarity. They spent the next hours in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ethan rummaged through the compartments, finding little of use, while Lyra tried to adjust to the strange environment of the human craft. Its walls were cold, unyielding metal so different from the natural materials her people used to build their homes. Despite her unease, she found herself strangely drawn to Ethan. There was a resilience about him, a stubborn will to live that mirrored her own. As night fell, the temperature dropped drastically. Lyra shivered, her thin, scaly skin poorly suited to the cold. Ethan noticed her discomfort and, with effort, reached out to his survival pack, pulling out a silver foil blanket. He wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands trembling slightly from the exertion. "Keep warm," he murmured, his voice faint but sincere. Lyra accepted the blanket with a grateful nod, though the human's generosity puzzled her. In her tribe, survival was often a solitary endeavor. To see him care for her, a stranger, touched something deep within her. She leaned back, allowing herself to feel a moment of warmth and comfort for the first time in days. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant howls of alien creatures prowling the wastelands. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The ship had little left to sustain them, and unless they found a way to procure food soon, they would both perish. But then, as exhaustion crept over her, she had an idea. There was something unique about human biology, something her elders had once mentioned in passing. A rare nutrient that only humans produced, one that was valuable for its unusual properties. She didn't know if it would work, or if it was merely a legend, but desperation urged her to try. As dawn broke over the desolate landscape, Lyra resolved to ask Ethan for his help. Survival, after all, sometimes demanded strange alliances and even stranger sacrifices. Chapter 2. A Fragile Alliance. The morning brought little warmth, and the harsh sunlight only served to highlight the desolation surrounding them. Lyra could feel her strength waning with every passing moment, but the presence of the human, Captain Ethan Gray, offered a strange comfort. He was a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this wasteland, even if they were both on the brink of collapse. Ethan stirred beside her, his face contorted in pain as he struggled to sit up. The wound on his side looked worse in the daylight, swollen and red, a clear sign of infection. Lyra wasn't well versed in human biology, but she understood the basic signs of illness. If left untreated, the infection would spread, and Ethan would have little chance of survival. And she knew that if he didn't survive, her own chances were slim. They had attempted to communicate during the night, each relying on gestures and the few shared words they could understand. It was frustratingly slow, but Lyra felt a certain respect building between them. She saw the way he pushed through his pain, refusing to give in to despair, and it inspired her to do the same. Ethan reached for a small translator device clipped to his belt. He fiddled with it, muttering something under his breath before speaking slowly, hoping the words would translate correctly. "We need to find food, shelter, and water." His voice was strained, each word carrying the weight of his exhaustion. Lyra nodded, understanding his intent even if the words were fragmented. She gestured to the barren landscape around them and mimicked a drinking motion, then shook her head. "No water," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's shoulders sagged as he processed this. He cast a weary glance at the horizon, as if hoping for some miracle to appear. But there was nothing, just endless stretches of rock and sand, a world devoid of life. A desperate idea began to form in Lyra's mind. It was something she'd heard as a child, a legend passed down through her tribe about the strange properties of human biology. Her people had always spoken of humans as beings of unusual strength and resilience, possessing unique biochemical properties that set them apart from other species. There was a tale that humans carried a nutrient within them, something rare and precious that could sustain certain life forms in dire situations. Lyra hesitated, her cheeks flushing a faint lavender as she considered the implications. It was a deeply personal request, one that could easily be misinterpreted, and she didn't know if Ethan would understand. But desperation made her bold. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm to get his attention. Ethan turned to her, his eyes questioning. Lyra took a deep breath, searching for the right words. She pointed to herself, then made a drinking motion, trying to convey her meaning. I need human, she said, struggling to form the sentence with the limited vocabulary they shared. Ethan's brow furrowed, clearly confused. He repeated her words slowly, as if trying to understand, then shook his head. I don't understand. Frustrated but undeterred, Lyra closed her eyes, trying to find another way to explain. She pressed her hand to her stomach, where the ache of hunger gnawed at her insides, then pointed to him again. You can help, she said, her voice soft but insistent. Realization dawned on Ethan's face, his expression shifting from confusion to a mix of surprise and discomfort. He understood now, or at least he thought he did. He hesitated, clearly wrestling with the implications of what she was asking. After a long silence, he gave a small nod, his gaze serious. If it helps you survive, he said slowly, then, okay. There was an awkward tension between them as they prepared for what was, to both of them, an unusual and uncomfortable experience. Lyra approached cautiously, her movements tentative as she leaned close to him. She felt a strange warmth radiating from him, a reminder of the differences between their species. His skin was soft and warm, a contrast to her own cool, scaled flesh. Ethan closed his eyes, taking slow, steady breaths to calm himself. Lyra placed her hand on his arm, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin, and focused on the faint hum of life that seemed to emanate from him. As she drew closer, she felt an unfamiliar sensation, a surge of energy, faint but unmistakable, as her body began to absorb the nutrients she needed. The process was gentle, almost soothing, as she felt the strength returning to her limbs. She could sense Ethan's discomfort, but he remained still, allowing her to take what she needed. It was a strange, almost intimate moment, a silent act of trust between two beings who barely knew each other. When she finally pulled away, she felt a renewed vigor coursing through her veins. The hunger that had plagued her was dulled, and her mind felt sharper, more focused. She looked at Ethan, her expression one of gratitude and relief. Thank you, she said, the sincerity in her voice transcending the language barrier. Ethan managed a weak smile, clearly drained but glad to have helped. He gestured to the translator, speaking softly. I'll be okay. We just need to get through this. They spent the rest of the day in relative silence, each lost in their thoughts. Lyra kept close to Ethan, watching over him as he rested, his energy depleted from the experience. She felt a strange sense of responsibility for him now, a bond formed through their shared struggle. He had given her the strength to survive, and she was determined to see them both make it out of this wasteland. As night fell, the temperature dropped once more, and Lyra wrapped herself in the silver foil blanket he'd given her. She glanced at Ethan, who was shivering despite his attempts to stay warm. Without a second thought, she moved closer, draping part of the blanket over him as well. They huddled together, their combined warmth providing a small measure of comfort against the cold. In the quiet darkness, Lyra felt a strange kinship with the human beside her. They were two beings from different worlds, each facing their own challenges, yet bound by a mutual need to survive. It was an unlikely alliance, born of necessity, but it had grown into something deeper, a fragile understanding, a shared determination to endure. As they drifted into an uneasy sleep, Lyra's mind wandered to thoughts of her tribe, of the family she'd lost in the chaos of the raid. She wondered if they were safe, if they even knew she was still alive. The thought brought a pang of sadness, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the present. She had Ethan now, and he had her. Together, they would find a way to survive, no matter the odds. Chapter 3. A Growing Bond. As the sun rose over the barren landscape, casting long shadows across the rocky outcroppings, Lyra and Ethan stirred from their uneasy slumber. Their bodies were weary, aching from the strain of the past days, but a sense of mutual determination kept them moving. Despite their differing physiologies and cultural backgrounds, they had developed a quiet rhythm, a shared will to survive that transcended words. Ethan sat up slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the wound on his side. The infection had worsened, and Lyra could see the pain etched across his face. She frowned, worried that he might not have much time left if they didn't find a solution. Yet, even in his weakened state, Ethan managed a faint smile when he caught her looking. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough but carrying a warmth that made Lyra's heart lift. She didn't fully understand the words, but the gentle tone told her all she needed to know. She mimicked his expression, her own mouth curving into a shy smile. In her tribe, communication was often through gestures, and she found comfort in this shared, silent language they were forming. As they scavenged through the wreckage of his ship, looking for anything useful, Ethan spoke softly, as if thinking out loud. "Back on Earth, we'd have medicines for this. But out here—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. Lyra tilted her head, catching the sadness in his tone. She didn't know much about Earth, only the vague stories passed down in her tribe. To her, humans were legendary beings, creatures of strength and mystery. But now, seeing Ethan up close, she realized how human he truly was, vulnerable and mortal, just like her. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Ethan, strong," she said, stumbling over his name but hoping he understood. Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at her, nodding in quiet gratitude. He knew she was trying to comfort him, and he appreciated it more than he could say. Despite the language barrier, her compassion resonated with him, a reminder of the bonds that could form even in the most unlikely circumstances. Over the next few days, their fragile alliance blossomed into something deeper. They shared what little they knew about each other's worlds, using gestures and drawings on the sand to bridge the gap in understanding. Lyra would sketch symbols from her language, showing Ethan the intricate glyphs that represented her people's beliefs, their connection to nature, and their respect for the world around them. Ethan, in turn, tried to explain the concept of family, of love, and the bonds that held humans together. One evening, as they sat beneath the cold, star-strewn sky, Ethan spoke of his family. His voice was low, almost wistful, as he described his parents, his younger sister, and the small town he called home. Lyra listened intently, her violet eyes wide with curiosity. Family was a universal concept, yet his words painted a picture of a world vastly different from her own. "On Earth, we protect each other," Ethan said, struggling to find words that would translate. "Family is everything." Lyra nodded slowly, understanding the sentiment even if the words were unfamiliar. Her own people had a similar bond, though they valued community over individual families. In her tribe, everyone was responsible for each other, a shared duty to ensure survival. She gestured to the stars, trying to convey the vastness of her people's beliefs, their reverence for the universe as a living entity. "Stars, guide us," she said softly, her voice laced with a deep, almost spiritual reverence. "We are one with them." Ethan looked up, following her gaze to the endless expanse above. In that moment, he felt a strange connection to her, a shared understanding of something greater than themselves. The stars were different, the worlds they came from vastly apart, yet they both looked to the sky with a sense of awe and wonder. Their conversations, though limited, brought them closer together. Lyra began to feel a sense of protectiveness toward Ethan, a fierce determination to keep him safe despite her own weakened state. She knew that without him, her chances of survival were slim, but it was more than that. Ethan had become more than just a companion in her struggle. He was a friend, someone she wanted to protect. Their survival depended on creativity and resourcefulness. They learned to fashion makeshift tools from the wreckage, using pieces of metal to build a small shelter against the sandstorms that occasionally swept across the wasteland. They found ways to collect what little moisture they could from the morning dew, each drop a precious lifeline. One night, however, their peace was shattered. A low, guttural growl echoed through the stillness, sending a chill down Lyra's spine. She recognized the sound. It was a predator, a creature that roamed the wastelands in search of prey. Her people called it the Drac, a fearsome beast known for its razor-sharp claws and relentless pursuit of anything that moved. Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the fear in her expression. Without hesitation, he grabbed a piece of metal, fashioning it into a crude spear. Lyra followed suit, her instincts honed from years of survival kicking in. They pressed their backs together, each facing a different direction as they prepared for the imminent attack. The drac emerged from the shadows, its eyes gleaming with predatory intent. It was a massive creature, its scaled body blending seamlessly with the rocky terrain. Lyra's heart raced as she gripped her weapon, steeling herself for the fight. She felt Ethan's presence behind her, a steadying force that gave her the courage to stand her ground. The battle was brutal, a blur of movement and noise as they fought to defend themselves. Lyra moved with a fluid grace, her movements instinctive as she dodged the creature's strikes, her spear darting in and out in quick, precise jabs. Ethan fought with a fierceness she hadn't seen before, his human strength a formidable force even in his weakened state. Together, they managed to drive the drac back, their combined efforts forcing it to retreat into the shadows. As the creature slinked away, wounded but alive, Lyra and Ethan collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily from the exertion. They were bruised and battered, their bodies aching, but they had survived. In the aftermath of the battle, Lyra turned to Ethan, a sense of awe and gratitude filling her chest. He had fought for her, risking his life to protect her, just as she had for him. It was a bond forged in fire, a connection that went beyond mere survival. Ethan looked at her, his expression weary but filled with a quiet pride. "We make a good team," he said, his words barely more than a whisper. Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, good team." They shared a small smile, a brief moment of warmth in the cold night. For the first time since they had met, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Together, they had faced a deadly threat and emerged victorious. It was a reminder of their resilience, of the strength that lay within each of them. As they sat beneath the stars, battered but unbroken, Lyra felt a profound sense of gratitude for this strange, stubborn human. He had become more than just a companion in her struggle. He was a friend, someone she was willing to fight for, just as he had fought for her. In the days that followed, their bond only deepened. They moved as one, a seamless partnership born of necessity and trust. Each day brought new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but they faced them together, their friendship a light in the darkness. And in the quiet moments, as they shared stories of their worlds and dreams of the future, Lyra began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this wasteland. Together. Chapter 4. Rescue and Rebirth. The days had blended into a haze of survival and companionship, each one marked by shared challenges and quiet triumphs. Lyra and Ethan had settled into a fragile, yet deeply fulfilling routine. Together, they had transformed the barren wastelands into a place of growth and resilience, finding strength in each other's presence. But as the harsh reality of their situation weighed on them, a faint hope had begun to blossom, a distant possibility of rescue that kept them going through the long, cold nights. One afternoon, as they rested under the shelter they'd built from scraps of Ethan's ship, a sudden, piercing light cut across the horizon. Lyra squinted, shielding her eyes as she looked up, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and disbelief. In the distance, she could make out a sleek, silver vessel descending toward them, its engines humming with a familiar, comforting sound. "It's them," Ethan breathed, his voice filled with relief and awe. His distress beacon had been activated for days, a faint, pulsing signal reaching out across the vastness of space, hoping to catch the attention of a passing ship. It was a long shot, but it had finally worked. The vessel landed a few meters away, its landing gear kicking up a plume of dust. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the ship, her heart pounding as a wave of emotions washed over her. Relief, gratitude, and a strange, bittersweet ache. This was the moment they had been hoping for, the end of their struggle. But it also meant parting ways, an idea that filled her with an unexpected sadness. The ship's hatch opened, and a group of humans stepped out, their faces masked but their postures unmistakably tense. One of them, a tall man with a commanding presence, called out as he approached. "Captain Gray, we've located you." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his expression a mixture of joy and fatigue. He turned to Lyra, offering her a small, grateful smile. "We did it," he said softly. "We survived." Lyra's throat tightened, and she nodded, unable to find the words to express the depth of her feelings. She wanted to thank him, to convey the gratitude and respect she felt, but her language fell short. Instead, she reached out, gently touching his arm in a gesture of farewell. Just then, another figure appeared, a tall, slender Galactic woman with silver hair and piercing, violet eyes. Lyra recognized her instantly. It was her elder sister, Rhea, a respected warrior and leader in their tribe. Rhea's eyes widened as she took in the sight of Lyra and Ethan standing side by side, her gaze shifting between them with a mixture of astonishment and suspicion. "Lyra," Rhea said, her voice a mix of relief and incredulity. "You survived." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady as she looked at her sister. "Yes, because of him." She gestured to Ethan, her voice filled with quiet pride. "He saved me. We saved each other." Rhea's eyes narrowed as she studied Ethan, clearly wary of the human presence. Humans were a rare sight in Galactic territories, and their people had always viewed them with caution. But seeing the bond between Lyra and Ethan, the silent understanding that had formed between them, gave her pause. After a tense silence, Rhea gave a reluctant nod, acknowledging Ethan with a respectful, if guarded, expression. "Thank you," she said, her voice formal, "for protecting my sister." Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "She protected me just as much. We wouldn't have survived without each other." Their mutual respect was evident, and it hung in the air as both rescue teams assessed the situation. The humans and Galactians exchanged cautious glances, unsure of how to proceed in the presence of the other. But Lyra and Ethan stood together, their bond a quiet testament to the power of unity, of trust born in the harshest conditions. As the two teams prepared to depart, Ethan turned to Lyra, his expression filled with a mix of emotions. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice low. "For everything." Lyra's eyes softened, and she managed a small smile. She wanted to say so much, to tell him how his resilience had inspired her, how his kindness had touched her in ways she hadn't expected. But words felt inadequate, a pale shadow of the connection they had shared. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart, a gesture of respect and gratitude in her culture. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "You are strong." Ethan chuckled, his own hand moving to mirror her gesture. "So are you, Lyra." They stood there, their hands over their hearts, a silent farewell that spoke volumes. Then, with a final nod, they each turned to join their respective teams, the reality of their parting settling over them like a heavy shroud. As Lyra boarded her sister's vessel, she cast one last glance at Ethan, committing his face to memory. He had become more than a friend, more than a companion in her struggle. He was a part of her now, a symbol of resilience and hope that she would carry with her always. The journey back to her tribe was filled with questions, her sister pressing her for details about the human, about the bond they had formed. But Lyra's answers were quiet, thoughtful, as she reflected on the experience. She spoke of Ethan's courage, his kindness, the way he had risked his life to protect her. And as she spoke, she realized that her own view of humanity had changed, her perception of their world forever altered. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his base, greeted by his own team with cheers and relief. But amid the celebrations, he found himself thinking of Lyra, of the quiet strength she had shown, the fierce determination that had matched his own. He knew he would never forget her, the alien girl who had become his friend in the desolation of the wastelands. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to spread through both the Galactic and human communities, stories of a human and a Galactic who had survived together, who had protected each other in the face of impossible odds. It was a tale that captured the imagination of both species, a story of resilience and unity that hinted at a future of cooperation and mutual respect. And though Lyra and Ethan were worlds apart, each went forward with the quiet hope that someday, their paths might cross again. For they had learned something precious in the wastelands, something that transcended language and culture, a bond that would endure beyond time and distance. As Lyra gazed up at the stars each night, she thought of him, her heart filled with a sense of wonder and gratitude. And as Ethan looked to the night sky, he, too, felt that same connection, a reminder of the unlikely friendship that had changed them both forever. They were survivors, united by a bond that neither distance nor time could break.